Chapter 9. The Misuse of Economics. Human decisions affecting the future cannot depend on strict mathematical expectation, since the basis for making such calculations does not exist. It is our innate urge to activity which makes the wheels go round, our rational selves choosing, but often falling back for our motive on whim or sentiment or chance. John Maynard Keynes, 1935. In the late 1940s, economics divorced itself from its former allies in political science, philosophy, and law, and sought a new alliance with the hard sciences of applied mathematics and physics. It is ironic that economics aligned with the classic physics of causality at exactly the time physicists themselves were embracing uncertainty and complexity. The creation of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1969, 74 years after the original Nobel Prize in Physics, confirmed this academic metamorphosis. Economists were the new high priests of a large part of human activity, wealth creation, jobs, savings, and investment, and came well equipped with equations, models, and computers needed to perform their priestly functions. There has never been a time since the rise of laissez-faire capitalism when economic systems were entirely free of turmoil. Bubbles, panics, crashes, and depressions have come and gone with the regularity of floods and hurricanes. This is not surprising because the underlying dynamics of economics, rooted in human nature, are always at work. Yet the new scientific economics promised better. Economists promised that through fine-tuning fiscal and monetary policy, rebalancing terms of trade, and spreading risk through the derivatives, market fluctuations would be smoothed, and the arc of growth extended beyond what had been possible in the past. Economists also promised that by casting off the gold standard they could provide money as needed to sustain growth, and that derivatives would put risk in the hands of those best able to bear it. However, the panic of 2008 revealed that the economic emperors wore no clothes. Only massive government interventions involving bank capital, interbank lending, money market guarantees, mortgage guarantees, deposit insurance, and many other expenditures prevented the wholesale collapse of capital markets and the economy. With few exceptions, the leading macroeconomists, policymakers, and risk managers failed to foresee the collapse and were powerless to stop it, except without the blunt object of unlimited free money. To explain why, it's illuminating to take 1947, the year of publication of Paul Samuelson's Foundations of Economic Analysis, as an arbitrary dividing line between the age of economics as social science and the new age of economics as natural science. That dividing line reveals similarities in market behavior before and after. The collapse of long-term capital management in 1998 bears comparison to the collapse of the Knickerbocker Trust and the panic of 1907 in its contagion dynamics and private resolution by bank counterparts with the most to lose. The stock market crash of October 19, 1987, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 22.61% in a single day, is reminiscent of the two-day drop of 23.05% on October 28 through 29, 1929. Unemployment in 2011 is comparable to the levels of the Great Depression, when consistent methodologies for the treatment of discouraged workers are used for both periods. In short, there is nothing about the post-1947 period of so-called hard economic science to suggest that it has had any success in mitigating the classic problems of boom and bust. In fact, there is much evidence to suggest that the modern practice of economics has left society worse off when one considers government deficit spending, the debt overhang, rising income inequality, and the armies of long-term unemployed. Recent failures have stripped economists of their immunity from rigorous scrutiny by average citizens. What works and what does not in economics is no longer just a matter of academic debate when 44 million Americans are on food stamps. Claims by economic theorists about multipliers, rationality, efficiency, correlation, and normally distributed risk are not mere abstractions. Such claims have become threats to the well-being of the nation. Signal failures of economics have arisen in Federal Reserve policy, Keynesianism, monetarism, and financial economics. Understanding these failures will allow us to comprehend why growth has stalled and currency wars loom. The Federal Reserve. The U.S. Federal Reserve System is the most powerful central bank in history and the dominant force in the U.S. economy today. The Fed is often described as possessing a dual mandate to provide price stability and to reduce unemployment. The Fed is also expected to act as a lender of last resort in a financial panic and is required to regulate banks, especially those deemed too big to fail. In addition, the Fed represents the United States at multilateral central bank meeting venues such as the G20 and the Bank for International Settlements, and conducts transactions using the Treasury's gold hoard. The Fed has been given new mandates under the Dodd-Frank reform legislation of 2010 as well. The dual mandate is more like a hydra-headed monster. From its creation in 1913, the most important Fed mandate has been to maintain the purchasing power of the dollar. However, since 1913, the dollar has lost over 95% of its value. Put differently, it takes $20 today to buy what $1 would buy in 1913. Imagine an investment manager losing 95% of a client's money to get a sense of how effectively the Fed has performed its primary task. The Fed's track record on dollar price stability should be compared to that of the Roman Republic, whose silver denarius maintained 100% of its original purchasing power for over 200 years, until it began to be debased by the Emperor Augustus in the late 1st century B.C. The gold solidus of the Byzantine Empire had an even more impressive track record, maintaining its purchasing power essentially unchanged for over 500 years, from the monetary reform of AD 498 until another debasement began in 1030. Fed defenders point out that while the dollar may have lost 95% of its purchasing power, wages have increased by a factor of over 20, so that increased wages offset the decreased purchasing power. The idea that prices and wages move together without harm is known as money neutrality. This theory, however, ignores the fact that while the process produces undeserving winners and losers. Losers are typically those Americans who are prudent savers and those living on pensions whose fixed returns are devalued by inflation. Winners are typically those using leverage as well as those with a better understanding of inflation and the resources to hedge against it with hard assets such as gold, land, and fine art. The effect of creating undeserving winners and losers is to distort investment decision-making, cause misallocations of capital, create asset bubbles, and increase income inequality. Inefficiency and unfairness are the real costs of failing to maintain price stability. Another mandate of the Fed is to function as a lender of last resort. In the classic formulation of 19th century economic writer Walter Bagehot, this means that in a financial panic, when all bank depositors want their money at once, a central bank should lend money freely to solvent banks against good collateral at a high rate of interest to allow banks to meet their obligations to depositors. This type of lending is typically not construed as a bailout, but rather as a way to convert good assets to cash when there is no other ready market for the assets. Once the panic subsides and confidence is restored, the loans can be repaid to the central bank and the collateral returned to the private banks. In the depths of the Great Depression, when this lender of last resort function was most needed, the Fed failed utterly. More than 10,000 banks in the United States were either closed or taken over, and assets in the banking system dropped almost 30%. Money was in such short supply that many Americans resorted to barter, in some cases trading eggs for sugar or coffee. This was the age of the wooden nickel, a homemade token currency that could be used by a local merchant to make change for a customer and then accepted later by other merchants in the vicinity in exchange for goods and services. The next time the lender of last resort function became as critical as it had been in the Great Depression was the Panic of 2008. The Fed acted in 2008 as if a liquidity crisis had begun, when it was actually a solvency and credit crisis. Short-term lending can help ease a liquidity crisis by acting as a bridge loan, but it cannot cure a solvency crisis when the collateral is permanently impaired. The solution for a solvency crisis is to shut down or nationalize the insolvent banks using existing emergency powers, move bad assets to government control, and reprivatize the new solvent bank in a public stock offering to new shareholders. The new bank is then in a position to make new loans. The benefit of putting the bad assets under government control is that they can be funded at low cost with no capital and no mark-to-market accounting for losses. The stockholders and bondholders of the insolvent bank and the FDIC insurance fund would bear the losses on the bad assets, and the taxpayers would be responsible only for any excess losses. Once again, the Fed misread the situation. Instead of shutting down insolvent banks, the Fed and the Treasury bailed them out with TARP funds and other gimmicks so that bondholders and bank management could continue to collect interest, profits, and bonuses at taxpayer expense. This was consistent with the Fed's actual mandate dating back to Jekyll Island, to save bankers from themselves. The Fed almost completely ignored Bagehot's core principles. It did lend freely, as Bagehot recommended, but it took weak collateral, much of which is still lodged on the Fed's books. The Fed charged almost no interest instead of the high rates typically demanded from borrowers in distress. The Fed also lent to insolvent banks rather than just to the solvent ones worth saving. The result for the economy, even now, is that bad assets are still in the system, bank lending is highly constrained due to a need to rebuild capital, and the economy continues to have great difficulty returning to self-sustaining growth. When most urgently called upon to perform its lender of last resort functions, the Fed has bungled both times. First in 1929 to 1933, when it should have provided liquidity and did not, then again in 2007 to 2009, when it should have closed insolvent banks, but instead provided liquidity. The upshot of these two episodes, curiously, is that the Fed has revealed it knows relatively little about the classic arts of banking. In 1978, the Humphrey-Hawkins Full Employment Act, signed by President Jimmy Carter, added management of unemployment to the Fed's mandate. The act was an explicit embrace of Keynesian economics and mandated the Fed and the executive branch to work together in order to achieve full employment, growth, price stability, and a balanced budget. The act set a specific numeric goal of 3% unemployment by 1983, which was to be maintained thereafter. In fact, unemployment subsequently reached cyclical peaks of 10.4% in 1983, 7.8% in 1992, 6.3% in 2003, and 10.1% in 2009. It was unrealistic to expect the Fed to achieve the combined goals of Humphrey-Hawkins all at once, although Fed officials still pay lip service to the idea in congressional testimony. In fact, the Fed has not delivered on its mandate to achieve full employment. As of 2011, full employment, as it is conventionally defined, is still 5 years away, according to the Fed's own estimates. To these failures of price stability, lender of last resort, and unemployment must be added the greatest failure of all, bank regulation. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, created by Congress in 2009 to examine the causes of the current financial and economic crisis in the United States, heard from more than 700 witnesses, examined millions of pages of documents, and held extensive hearings in order to reach conclusions about the responsibility for the financial crisis that began in 2007. The Commission concluded that regulatory failure was a primary cause of the crisis, and it laid that failure squarely at the feet of the Fed. The official report reads, "We conclude this crisis was avoidable. The crisis was the result of human action and inaction. The prime example is the Federal Reserve's pivotal failure to stem the flow of toxic mortgages, which it could have done by setting prudent mortgage lending standards. The Federal Reserve was the one entity empowered to do so, and it did not. We conclude widespread failures in financial regulation and supervision proved devastating to the stability of the nation's financial markets. The sentries were not at their posts, yet we do not accept the view that regulators lacked the power to protect the financial system. They had ample power in many arenas, and they chose not to use it. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York and other regulators could have clamped down on Citigroup's excesses in the run-up to the crisis. They did not. In case after case, regulators continued to rate institutions they oversaw as safe and sound, even in the face of mounting troubles. The report goes on for more than 500 pages to detail the Fed's regulatory failures in minute detail. As noted in the previous excerpt, all of the Fed's failures were avoidable. One last test of Fed competencies involves the Fed's handling of its own balance sheet. The Fed may be a central bank, but it is still a bank, with a balance sheet and net worth. A balance sheet has two sides: assets, which are the things owned, and liabilities, which are the things owed to others. Net worth, also called capital, equals the assets minus the liabilities. The Fed's assets are mostly government securities it buys, and its liabilities are mostly the money it prints to buy them. As of April 2011, the Fed had a net worth of approximately $60 billion and assets approaching $3 trillion. If the Fed's assets declined in value by 2%, a fairly small event in volatile markets, the 2% decline applied to $3 trillion in assets produces a $60 billion loss, enough to wipe out the Fed's capital. The Fed would then be insolvent. Could this happen? It has happened already, but the Fed does not report it because it is not required to revalue its assets to market value. This situation will come to a head when it comes time to unwind the Fed's quantitative easing program by selling bonds. The Fed may ignore mark-to-market losses in the short run, but when it sells the bonds, those losses will have to be shown on the books. The Federal Reserve is well aware of this problem. In 2008, the Fed sent officials to meet with Congress to discuss the possibility of the Fed propping up its balance sheet by issuing its own bonds as the Treasury does now. In 2009, Janet Yellen, then president of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, went public with this request in a New York speech. Regarding the power to issue the new Fed bonds, Yellen said, "I would feel happier having it now, and it would certainly be a nice thing to have." Yellen seemed eager to get the program underway, and with good reason. The Fed's lurch toward insolvency was becoming more apparent by the day as it plied more leverage on its capital base. By getting permission from Congress to issue new Fed bonds, the Federal Reserve could unwind quantitative easing without having to sell the existing bonds on its books. Sales of the new Fed bonds would be substitutes for sales of the old Treasury bonds to reduce the money supply. By this substitution, the losses on the old Treasury bonds would stay hidden. This bond scam was shot down on Capitol Hill, and once it failed, the Fed needed another solution quickly. It was running out of time before QE would need to be reversed. The solution was a deal arrived at between the Treasury and the Fed that did not require approval from Congress. The Fed earns huge profits every year on the interest received on Treasury bonds the Fed owns. The Fed customarily pays these profits back to the Treasury. In 2010, the Fed and Treasury agreed that the Fed should suspend the repayments indefinitely. The Fed keeps the cash, and the amount the Fed would normally pay to the Treasury is set up as a liability account, basically an IOU. This is unprecedented and is a sign of just how desperate the situation has become. Now, as losses on future bond sales arise, the Fed does not reduce capital, as would normally occur. Instead, the Fed increases the amount of IOU to the Treasury. In effect, the Fed is issuing private IOUs to the Treasury and using the cash to avoid appearing insolvent. As long as the Fed can keep issuing these IOUs, its capital will not be wiped out by losses on its bond positions. On paper, the Fed's capital problem is solved, but in reality, the Fed is increasing its leverage and parking its losses at the Treasury. Corporate executives who played these kinds of accounting games would be sent to jail. It should not escape notice that the Treasury is a public institution, while the Fed is a private institution owned by banks. So this accounting sham is another example of depriving the taxpayers of funds for the benefit of the banks. The United States now has a system in which the Treasury runs non-sustainable deficits and sells bonds to keep from going broke. The Fed prints money to buy those bonds and incurs losses by owning them. Then the Treasury takes IOUs back from the Fed to keep from going broke. It is quite the high-wire act, and amazing to behold. The Treasury and the Fed resemble two drunks leaning on each other so neither one falls down. Today, with its 50-to-1 leverage and investment in volatile intermediate-term securities, the Fed looks more like a poorly run hedge fund than a central bank. Ed Koch, the popular mayor of New York in the 1980s, was famous for walking around the city and asking passers-by, in his distinctive New York accent, "How am I doing?" as a way to get feedback on his administration. If the Fed were to ask, "How am I doing?" the answer would be that since its formation in 1913, it has failed to maintain price stability, failed as a lender of last resort, failed to maintain full employment, failed as a bank regulator, and failed to preserve the integrity of its balance sheet. The Fed's one notable success has been that, under its custody, the Treasury's gold hoard has increased in value from about $11 billion at the time of the Nixon shock in 1971 to over $400 billion today. Of course, this increase in the value of gold is just the flip side of the Fed's demolition of the dollar. On the whole, it is difficult to think of another government agency that has failed more consistently on more of its key missions than the Fed. Monetarism. Monetarism is an economic theory most closely associated with Milton Friedman, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1976. Its basic tenet is that changes in the money supply are the most important cause of changes in GDP. These GDP changes, when measured in dollars, can be broken into two components: a real component, which produces actual gains, and an inflationary component, which is illusory. The real plus the inflationary equals the nominal increase, measured in total dollars. Friedman's contribution was to show that increasing the money supply in order to increase output would work only up to a certain point. Beyond that, any nominal gains would be inflationary and not real. In effect, the Fed could print money to get nominal growth, but there would be a limit to how much real growth could result. Friedman also surmised that the inflationary effects of increasing the money supply might occur with a lag, so that, in the short run, printing money might increase real GDP, but inflation would show up later to offset the initial gains. Friedman's idea was encapsulated in an equation known as the quantity theory of money. The variables are M, money supply, V, velocity of money, P, price level, and lowercase y, real GDP, expressed as MV equals P lowercase y. This is stated as money supply, M, times velocity, V, equals nominal GDP, which can be broken into its components of price changes, P, and real growth, Y. Money supply, M, is controlled by the Fed. The Fed increases money supply by purchasing government bonds with printed money, and decreases money supply by selling the bonds for money that then disappears. Velocity, V, is just the measure of how quickly money turns over. If someone spends $1 and the recipient also spends it, that dollar has a velocity of 2 because it was spent twice. If instead the dollar is put in the bank, that dollar has a velocity of 0 because it was not spent at all. On the other side of the equation, nominal GDP growth has its real component, Y, and its inflation component, P. For decades, one of the most important questions to flow from this equation was, is there a natural limit to the amount that the real economy can expand before inflation takes over? Real growth in the economy is limited by the amount of labor and the productivity of that labor. Population growth in the United States is about 1.5% per year. Productivity increases vary, but 2% to 2.5% per year is a reasonable estimate. The combination of people and productivity means that the U.S. economy can grow about 3.5% to 4% per year in real terms. That is the upper limit of the long-term growth of real output, or Y, in the equation. A monetarist attempting to fine-tune Fed monetary policy would say that if Y can grow at only 4%, then an ideal policy would be one in which money supply grows at 4%. velocity is constant, and the price level is constant. This would be a world of near maximum real growth and near zero inflation. If increasing the money supply in modest increments were all there was to it, Fed monetary policy would be the easiest job in the world. In fact, Milton Friedman once suggested that a properly programmed computer could adjust the money supply with no need for a Federal Reserve. Start with a good estimate of the natural real growth rate for the economy, dial up the money supply by the same target rate, and watch the economy grow without inflation. It might need a little tweaking for timing lags and changes in the growth estimate due to productivity, but it's all fairly simple as long as the velocity of money is constant. But what if velocity is not constant? It turns out that money velocity is the great joker in the deck, the factor that no one can control, the variable that cannot be fine-tuned. Velocity is psychological. It all depends on how an individual feels about her economic prospects, or about how all consumers in the aggregate feel. Velocity cannot be controlled by the Fed's printing press or advancements in productivity. It is a behavioral phenomenon, and a powerful one. Think of the economy as a 10-speed bicycle, with money supply as the gears, velocity as the brakes, and the bicycle rider as the consumer. By shifting gears up or down, the Fed can help the rider accelerate or climb hills. Yet if the rider puts on the brakes hard enough, the bike slows down no matter what gear the bike is in. If the bike is going too fast and the rider puts on the brakes hard, the bike can skid or crash. In a nutshell, this is the exact dynamic that has characterized the U.S. economy for over 10 years. After peaking at 2.12 in 1997, velocity has been declining precipitously ever since. The drop in velocity accelerated as a result of the panic of 2008, falling from 1.8 in 2008 to 1.67 in 2009, a 7% drop in 1 year. This is an example of the consumer slamming on the brakes. More recently, in 2010, velocity is leveled off at 1.71. When consumers pay down debt and increase savings instead of spending, velocity drops, as does GDP, unless the Fed increases the money supply. So, the Fed has been furiously printing money just to maintain nominal GDP in the face of declining velocity. The Fed has another problem in addition to the behavioral and not easily controlled nature of velocity. The money supply that the Fed controls by printing, called the monetary base, is only a small part of the total money supply, about 20% according to recent data. The other 80% is created by banks when they make loans or support other forms of asset creation, such as money market funds and commercial paper. While the monetary base increased 242% from January 2008 to January 2011, the broader money supply increased only 34%. This is because banks are reluctant to make new loans and are struggling with the toxic loans still on their books. Furthermore, consumers and businesses are afraid to borrow from the banks, either because they are over-leveraged to begin with, or because of uncertainties about the economy and doubts about their ability to repay. The transmission mechanism from base money to total money supply has broken down. The MV equals PY equation is critical to an understanding of the dynamic forces at play in the economy. If the money, M, expansion mechanism is broken because banks will not lend, and velocity, V, is flat or declining because of consumer fears, then it is difficult to see how the economy, PY, can expand. This brings us to the crux. The factors that the Fed can control, such as base money, are not working fast enough to revive the economy and decrease unemployment. The factors that the Fed needs to accelerate are bank lending and velocity, which result in more spending and investment. Spending, however, is driven by the psychology of lenders, borrowers, and consumers, essentially a behavioral phenomenon. Therefore, to revive the economy, the Fed needs to change mass behavior, which inevitably involves the arts of deception, manipulation, and propaganda. To increase velocity, the Fed must instill in the public either euphoria from the wealth effect or fear of inflation. The idea of the wealth effect is that consumers will spend more freely if they feel more prosperous. The favored route to a wealth effect is an increase in asset values. For this purpose, the Fed's preferred asset classes are stock prices and home prices, because they are widely known and closely watched. After falling sharply from a peak in mid-2006, home prices stabilized during late 2009 and rose slightly in early 2010 due to the policy intervention of the first-time homebuyers tax credit. By late 2010, that program was discontinued, and home prices began to decline again. By early 2011, home prices nationwide had returned to the levels of mid-2003 and seemed headed for further declines. It appeared there would be no wealth effect from housing this time around. The Fed did have greater success in propping up the stock market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average increased almost 90% from March 2009 through April 2011. The Fed's zero interest rate policy left investors with few places to go if they wanted returns above zero. Yet the stock rally also failed to produce the desired wealth effects. Some investors made money, but many more stayed away from stocks because they had lost confidence in the market after 2008. Faced with its inability to generate a wealth effect, the Fed turned to its only other behavioral tool, instilling fear of inflation in consumers. To do this in a way that increased borrowing and velocity, the Fed had to manipulate three things at once: nominal rates, real rates, and inflation expectations. The idea was to keep nominal rates low and inflation expectations high. The object was to create negative real rates, the difference between nominal rates minus the expected rate of inflation. For example, if inflation expectations are 4% and nominal interest rates are 2%, then real interest rates are negative 2%. When real rates are negative, borrowing becomes attractive, and both spending and investment grow. According to the monetarists' formula, this potent combination of more borrowing, which expands the money supply, and more spending, which increases velocity, would grow the economy. This policy of negative real rates and fear of inflation was the Fed's last, best hope to generate a self-sustaining recovery. Negative interest rates create a situation in which dollars can be borrowed and paid back in cheaper dollars due to inflation. It is like renting a car with a full tank of gas and returning the car with the tank half empty at no charge to the user. Consumers and businesses find this difficult to pass up. The Fed's plan was to encourage borrowing through negative interest rates and encourage spending through fear of inflation. The resulting combination of leverage and inflation expectations might increase money supply and velocity, and therefore increase GDP. This could work, but what would it take to increase expectations? Extensive theoretical work on this had been done by Ben Bernanke and Paul Krugman in the late 1990s as a result of studying a similar episode in Japan during its lost decade. A definitive summary of this research was written by economist Lars Svensson in 2003. Svensson was a colleague of Bernanke's and Krugman's at Princeton, and later became a central banker himself. Svensson's paper is the Rosetta Stone of the currency wars, because it reveals the linkage between currency depreciation and negative real interest rates as a way to stimulate an economy at the expense of other countries. Svensson discusses the benefits of currency war. Even if the interest rate is zero, a depreciation of the currency provides a powerful way to stimulate the economy. A currency depreciation will stimulate an economy directly by giving a boost to export sectors. More importantly, a currency depreciation and a peg of the currency rate at a depreciated rate serves as a conspicuous commitment to a higher price level in the future. Svensson also describes the difficulties of manipulating the public in the course of pursuing these policies. If the central bank could manipulate private sector beliefs, it would make the private sector believe in future inflation. The real interest rate would fall, and the economy would soon emerge from recession. The problem is that private sector beliefs are not easy to affect. Here was Bernanke's entire playbook. Keep interest rates at zero, devalue the dollar by quantitative easing, and manipulate opinion to create fear of inflation. Bernanke's policies of zero interest rates and quantitative easing provided the fuel for inflation. Ironically, Bernanke's fiercest critics were helping his plan by incessantly sounding the inflation alarm. They were stoking inflation fears with language no Fed chairman could ever use himself. This was central banking with the mask off. It was not the cool, rational, scientific pursuit of disinterested economists sitting in the Fed's marble temple in Washington. It was an exercise in deception and hoping for the best. When prices of oil, silver, gold, and other commodities began to rise steeply in 2011, Bernanke was publicly unperturbed and made it clear that actual interest rates would remain low. In fact, increasing inflation anxiety reported from around the world combined with continued low rates was exactly what the theories of Bernanke, Krugman, and Svensson advocated. America had become a nation of guinea pigs in a grand monetary experiment cooked up in the petri dish of the Princeton economics department. The Bernanke-Krugman-Svensson theory makes it clear that the Fed's public efforts to separate monetary policy from currency wars are disingenuous. Easy money and dollar devaluation are two sides of the same coin, and currency wars are part of the plan. Easy money and dollar devaluation are designed to work together to cause actual inflation and to raise inflation expectations while holding interest rates low to get the lending and spending machine back in gear. This is clear to the Chinese, the Arabs, and other emerging markets in Asia and Latin America that have complained vociferously about the Fed's stewardship of the dollar. The question is whether the collapse of the dollar is obvious to the American people. Fundamentally, monetarism is insufficient as a policy tool, not because it gets the variables wrong, but because the variables are too hard to control. Velocity is a mirror of the consumer's confidence or fear, and can be highly volatile. The money supply transmission mechanism from base money to bank loans can break down because of the lack of certainty and confidence on the part of lenders and borrowers. The danger is that the Fed does not accept these behavioral limitations and tries to control them anyway through communication tinged with deception and propaganda. Worse yet, when the public realizes that it is being deceived, a feedback loop is created in which trust is broken, and even the truth, if it can be found, is no longer believed. The United States is dangerously close to that point. Keynesianism. John Maynard Keynes died in 1946, and so never lived to see the errors committed in his name. His death came just 1 year before the publication of Samuelson's Foundations of Economic Analysis, which laid the intellectual base for what became known as Neo-Keynesian economics. Keynes himself used few equations in his writings, but did provide extensive analysis in clear prose. It was only in the late 1940s and 1950s that many of the models and graphs associated today with Keynesian economics came into existence. This is where the conceptual errors espoused under the name Keynesian are embedded. What Keynes would have thought of those errors had he lived is open to speculation. Near the end of his life, Keynes supported a new currency, which he called the bancor, with a value anchored to a commodity basket, including gold. He was, of course, a fierce critic of the gold exchange standard of the 1920s, but he was practical enough to realize that currencies must be anchored to something, and for this reason, preferred a global commodity standard to the dollar and gold standard that emerged from Bretton Woods in 1944. Our purpose here is not to review the field of Keynesian economics at large, but rather to zero in on the flaw most relevant to the currency wars. In the case of monetarism, the flaw was the volatility of velocity, as expressed in consumer choice. In Keynesianism, the flaw is the famous multiplier. The Keynesian multiplier theory rests on the assumption that $1 of government deficit spending can produce more than $1 of total economic output, after all secondary effects are taken into account. The multiplier is the Bigfoot of economics, something that many assume exists but is rarely, if ever, seen. The foundation of Keynesian public policy is called aggregate demand, or the total of all spending and investment in the domestic economy, excluding inventories. For example, if a worker is fired, he not only loses his income, But he also then stops spending in ways that cause others to lose income as well. The lost income and lost spending can cause a drop in aggregate demand, which can feed on itself, leading more businesses to fire more employees who then spend less, and so on in a vicious cycle. Keynesian theory says that government can step in and spend money that individuals cannot or will not spend, thereby increasing aggregate demand. The government spending can reverse the slide and contribute to renewed economic growth. The problem with this theory of government spending to boost aggregate demand is that governments have no money of their own in the first instance. Governments have to print the money, take the money in the form of taxes, or borrow the money from their citizens or from abroad. Printing money can cause nominal growth, but it can also cause inflation, so that real growth is unchanged over time. Taxing and borrowing may enable the government to spend more, but it means there is less for the private sector to spend or invest. So it is not clear how aggregate demand increases. This is where the multiplier claims to play a role. The idea of the multiplier is that $1 of government spending will stimulate more spending by others and result in more than $1 of increased output. And this is the justification for taking the dollar from the private sector. How much more output is yielded by $1 of government spending? Put differently, what is the size of the multiplier? In a famous study written just before the start of President Obama's administration, two of Obama's advisors, Christina Romer and Jared Bernstein, looked at the multiplier in connection with the proposed 2009 stimulus program. Romer and Bernstein estimated the multiplier at about 1.54 once the new spending was up and running. This means that for every $100 billion in the Obama spending program, Romer and Bernstein expected output to increase by $154 billion. Since the entire Obama program ended up at $786 billion, the extra output from just doing the stimulus program would amount to $425 billion, the largest free lunch in history. The purpose of this stimulus was to offset the effects of the depression that had begun in late 2007 and to save jobs. The Obama administration ran U.S. fiscal year deficits over $1.4 trillion in 2009 and $1.2 trillion in 2010. The administration projected further deficits of $1.6 trillion in 2011 and $1.1 trillion in 2012, an astounding total of over $5.4 trillion in just 4 years. In order to justify the $787 billion program of extra stimulus in 2009 with deficits of this magnitude, it was critical to show that America would be worse off without the spending. The evidence for the Keynesian multiplier had to be rock solid. It did not take long for the evidence to arrive. 1 month after the Romer and Bernstein study, another far more rigorous study of the same spending program was produced by John B. Taylor and John F. Kogan of Stanford University and their colleagues. Central to the results shown by Taylor and Kogan is that all of the multipliers are less than 1, meaning that for every dollar of stimulus spending, the amount of goods and services produced by the private sector declines. Taylor and Kogan employed a more up-to-date multiplier model that has attracted wider support among economists and uses more realistic assumptions about the projected path of interest rates and expectations of consumers in the face of higher tax burdens in the future. The Taylor and Kogan study put the multiplier effect of the Obama stimulus program at 0.96 in the early stages, but showed it falling rapidly to 0.67 by the end of 2009 and to 0.48 by the end of 2010. Their study showed that by 2011, for each stimulus dollar spent, private sector output would fall by almost 60 cents. The Obama stimulus program was hurting the private sector and therefore handicapping the private sector's ability to create jobs. The Taylor and Kogan study was not the only study to reach the conclusion that Keynesian multipliers are less than 1 and that stimulus programs destroy private sector output. John Taylor had reached similar conclusions in a separate 1993 study. Empirical support for Keynesian multipliers of less than 1 in certain conditions was reported in separate studies by Michael Woodford of Columbia University, Robert Barrow of Harvard, and Michael Kumhoff of Stanford, among others. A review of the economic literature shows that the methods used by Romer and Bernstein to support the Obama stimulus program were outside the mainstream of economic thought and difficult to support, except for ideological reasons. Keynes's theory that government spending could stimulate aggregate demand turns out to be one that works in limited conditions only, making it more of a special theory than the general theory he had claimed. Stimulus programs work better in the short run than the long run. Stimulus works better in a liquidity crisis than a solvency crisis, and better in a mild recession than a severe one. Stimulus also works better for economies that have entered recessions with relatively low debt levels at the outset. The seminal yet still underappreciated econometric work of Professor Carl F. Christ from the 1960s theorized that both Keynesian and monetarist tools work most powerfully for economies that have started with a balanced budget. Christ was the first to identify what he called the government budget restraint, a concept that seems to have been forgotten in the meantime. Christ wrote, "Results suggest forcefully that both the extreme fiscal advocates and extreme monetary advocates are wrong. Fiscal variables strongly influence the effect of a given change in the money stock, and open market operations strongly influence the effects of given changes in government expenditures and taxation." Christ was saying that the impact of Keynesian stimulus could not be gauged independently of the deficit starting line. None of the favorable conditions for Keynesian stimulus was present in the United States in early 2009. The country was heavily burdened with debt, was running huge deficits, and was suffering from a severe solvency crisis that promised to continue for many years. Exactly the wrong environment for Keynesian stimulus. The stimulus spending would increase the deficit and waste valuable resources, but not do much else. 2 years after the Romer and Bernstein study, the economic results were in, and they were devastating to their thesis. Romer and Bernstein had estimated total employment at over 137 million by the end of 2010. The actual number was only about 130 million. They had estimated GDP would increase 3.7% by late 2010. However, it had barely increased at all. They had also estimated that recession unemployment would peak at 8%. Unfortunately, it peaked at 10.1% in October 2009. By every measure, the economy performed markedly worse than Romer and Bernstein had anticipated using their version of the Keynesian multiplier. From the start, the Obama stimulus was little more than an ideological wish list of favored programs and constituencies, dressed up in the academic robes of John Maynard Keynes. The Romer-Bernstein plan almost certainly saved some jobs in the unionized government sector. However, few had argued that the stimulus would produce no jobs, merely that the hidden costs were too high. The combination of deficit spending, monetary ease, and bank bailouts had boosted the economy in the short run. The problem was that the recovery was artificial and not self-sustaining, because it had been induced by government spending and ease money, rather than by private sector consumption and investment. This led to a political backlash against further deficit spending and quantitative easing. The increased debt from the failed Keynesian stimulus became a cause célèbre in the currency wars. These wars were primarily about devaluing a country's currency, which is a form of default. A country defaults to its foreign creditors when its claims suddenly become worth less through devaluation. A country defaults to its own people through inflation and higher prices for imported goods. With debt in the hands of foreign investors reaching unprecedented levels, the international impact of devaluation was that much greater, so the currency wars would be fought that much harder. Because debt and deficits are now so large, the United States has run out of dry powder. If the United States were struck by another financial crisis or natural disaster of the magnitude of Hurricane Katrina or greater, its ability to resort to deficit spending would be impaired. If the United States were confronted with a major war in the Middle East or East Asia, it would not have the financial wherewithal to support a war effort, as it had done in World War II. Vulnerability to foreign creditors is now complete. In the face of any one of these crises, financial, natural, or military, the United States would be forced to resort to emergency measures, as had FDR in 1933 and Nixon in 1971. Bank closings, gold seizures, import tariffs, and capital controls would be on the table. America's infatuation with the Keynesian illusion has now resulted in U.S. power being an illusion. America can only hope that nothing bad happens. Yet, given the course of events in the world, that seems a slim reed on which to lean. Financial economics. At about the same time that Paul Samuelson and others were developing their Keynesian theories, another group of economists were developing a theory of capital markets. From the faculties of Yale, MIT, and the University of Chicago came a torrent of carefully reasoned academic papers by future Nobel Prize winners such as Harry Markowitz, Merton Miller, William Sharpe, and James Tobin. Their papers, published in the 1950s and 1960s, argued that investors cannot beat the market on a consistent basis, and that a diversified portfolio that broadly tracks the market will produce the best results over time. A decade later, a younger generation of academics, including Myron Scholes, Robert C. Merton, son of famed sociologist Robert K. Merton, and Fisher Black, came forward with new theories on the pricing of options, opening the door to the explosive growth of financial futures and other derivatives contracts ever since. The work of these and other scholars, accumulated over 50 years and continuing today, constitutes the branch of economic science known as financial economics. University biologists working with infectious viruses have airtight facilities to ensure that the objects of their study do not escape from the laboratory and damage the population at large. Unfortunately, no such safeguards are imposed on economics departments. For every brilliant insight, there are some dangerous misconceptions that have infected the world's financial bloodstream and caused incalculable harm. None of these ideas has done more harm than the twin toxins of financial economics known as efficient markets and the normal distribution of risk. The idea behind the efficient market is that investors are solely interested in maximizing their wealth and will respond in a rational manner to price signals and new information. The theory assumes that when material new information arrives, it is factored into prices immediately, so that prices move smoothly from one level to another based on the news. Since the markets efficiently price in all of this new information immediately, no investor can beat the market except by pure luck, because any information that an investor might want to use to make an investment decision is already reflected in the market price. Since the next piece of new information is unknowable in advance, future price movements are unpredictable and random. The idea of normally distributed risk is that, since future price movements are random, the severity and frequency of price swings will also be random, like a coin toss or roll of the dice. Mild events happen frequently, and extreme events happen infrequently. When the frequent mild events and infrequent severe events are put on a graph, it takes the shape of the famous bell curve. The large majority of outcomes are bunched in the area of low severity, with far fewer events in the high severity region. Because the curve tails off steeply, high extreme events are so rare as to be almost impossible. Imagine a bell curve placed above a line that begins at -3 on the left and counts up to +3 on the right. In this graph, the height of the curve shows how often events happen, and the numbers along the bottom indicate how severe the events are, either positive or negative. The area centered on 0, where the curve is highest, shows mild events happen most frequently. Consider the area of the curve beyond -3 or +3. This area would represent events of much greater severity, events like stock market crashes or the bursting of housing bubbles. Yet, according to this bell curve, they almost never happen. This is shown by the fact that the curve practically touches the horizontal baseline at -3 and the other end at +3, which signifies things beyond that measure never happen at all. The problem with the Nobel Prize-winning theories based on the bell curve is that empirical evidence shows they do not correspond to the real world of markets and human behavior. Based on an enormous body of statistical and social science research, it is clear that markets are not efficient, that price movements are not random, and risk is not nominally distributed. The academic counterattack on these tenets of financial economics have come from two directions. From the fields of psychology, sociology, and biology came a flood of studies showing that investors are irrational after all, at least from the perspective of wealth maximization. From iconoclastic mathematical genius Benoit Mandelbrot came insights that showed future prices are not independent of the past, that the market had a kind of memory that could cause it to react or overreact in disruptive ways, giving rise to alternating periods of boom and bust. Daniel Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky demonstrated in a series of simple but brilliantly constructed experiments that individuals were full of irrational biases. The subjects of their experiments were more concerned about avoiding a loss than achieving a gain, even though an economist would say the two outcomes had exactly the same value. This trait, called risk aversion, helps to explain why investors will dump stocks in a panic but be slow to re-enter the market once it turns around. When economists began searching capital markets data for the kind of irrationality that Kahneman and Tversky had demonstrated, they had no trouble finding it. Among the anomalies discovered were that trends, once set in motion, were more likely to continue than reverse, the basis of momentum investing. It also appeared that small-cap stocks outperform large-cap stocks. Others identified the so-called January effect, which showed that stocks performed better in January than other months. None of these findings are consistent with efficient markets or random price movements. The debate between the efficient markets theorists and the social scientists would be just another arcane academic struggle, but for one critical fact. The theory of efficient markets and its corollaries of random price movements and a bell curve distribution of risk had escaped from the lab and infected the entire trading apparatus of Wall Street and the modern banking system. The application of these flawed theories to actual capital markets activity contributed to the 1987 stock market crash, the 1998 implosion of long-term capital management, and the greatest catastrophe of all, the panic of 2008. One contagious virus that spread the financial economics disease was known as value at risk, or VAR. Value at risk is the method Wall Street used to manage risk in the decade leading up to the panic of 2008, and is still in widespread use today. It is a way to measure risk in an overall portfolio. Certain risky positions are offset against other positions to reduce risk, and VAR claims to measure that offset. For example, a long position in 10-year Treasury notes might be offset by a short-year position in 5-year Treasury notes, so that the net risk, according to VAR, is much less than either of the separate risks of the notes. There is no limit to the number of complicated offsetting baskets that can be constructed. The mathematics quickly become daunting because clear relationships, such as longs and shorts in the same bond, give way to the multiple relationships of many items in the hedging basket. Value at risk is the mathematical culmination of 50 years of financial economics. Importantly, it assumes that future relationships between prices will resemble the past. VAR assumes that price fluctuations are random and that risk is embedded in net positions, long minus short, instead of gross positions. VAR carries the intellectual baggage of efficient markets and nominal distributions into the world of risk management. The role of VAR in causing the panic of 2008 is immense, but has never been thoroughly explored. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission barely considered trading risk models. The highly conflicted and fraudulent roles of mortgage brokers, investment bankers, and ratings agencies have been extensively examined. Yet the role of VAR has remained hidden. In many ways, VAR was the invisible thread that ran through all the excesses that led to the collapse. What was it that allowed the banks, ratings agencies, and investors to assume that their positions were safe? What was it that gave the Federal Reserve and the SEC comfort that the banks and brokers had adequate capital? Why did risk managers continually assure their CEOs and boards of directors that everything was under control? The answers revolve around value at risk and its related models. The VAR models gave the all-clear to higher leverage and massive off-balance sheet exposures. Since the regulators did not know as much about VAR as the banks, they were in no position to question the risk assessments. Regulators allowed the banks to self-regulate when it came to risk and leverage. It was as if the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission allowed the builders of nuclear power plants to set their own safety specifications, with no independent review. Many scholars and practitioners have been aware of the flaws and limitations in VAR. The truth is that the flaws were well known and widely discussed for over a decade, both in academia and on Wall Street. The banks continued to use VAR not because it worked, but because it permitted a pretense of safety that allowed them to use excessive leverage and make larger profits while being backstopped by the taxpayers when things went wrong. Using VAR to manage risk is like driving a car at 100 miles per hour while the speedometer has been rigged to stay at 50 miles per hour. Regulators in the back seat of the car glance at the speedometer and see 50, then go back to sleep. Meanwhile, the car careens wildly like something from a scene in Mad Max. The destructive legacy of financial economics, with its false assumptions about randomness, efficiency, and nominal risk distributions, is hard to quantify, but $60 trillion in destroyed wealth in the months following the panic of 2008 is a good estimate. Derivatives contracts did not shift risk to strong hands. Instead, derivatives concentrated risk in the hands of those too big to fail. VAR did not measure risk. It buried it behind a wall of equations that intimidated regulators who should have known better. Human nature and all its quirks were studiously ignored by the banks and regulators. When the financial economy was wrecked and its ability to aid commerce was well and truly destroyed, the growth engine went into low gear and has remained there ever since. Washington and Wall Street, the twin towers of deception. By the start of the new currency war in 2010, central banking was based not on principles of sound money, but on the ability of central bankers to use communication to mislead citizens about their true intentions. Monetarism was based on unstable relationships between velocity and money that made it ineffective as a policy tool. Keynesianism was applied recklessly based on a mythical multiplier that was presumed to create income but actually destroyed it. Financial economics was a skyscraper erected on the quicksand of efficient markets and nominal risk distributions that bore no relation to real behavior in capital markets. The entire system of fiscal policy, monetary policy, banking, and risk management was intellectually corrupt and dishonest, and the flaws persist to this day. Recently, new and better economic paradigms have emerged. However, Washington and Wall Street both have a vested interest in the flawed models from the past. For Washington, Keynesianism is an excuse to expand spending, and monetarism is an excuse to concentrate power at the Fed. For Wall Street, the theories of financial economics provide cover for high leverage and deceptive sales practices for off-balance sheet derivatives. On Wall Street, profits come first and good science second. If some theory, however flawed or out of date, can be trotted out with the right academic pedigree to provide a rationale for risk-taking, then that is fine. If politicians and regulators are even further behind the learning curve than Wall Street, then that is fine too. As long as the profits continue on Wall Street, the hard questions will not be asked, let alone answered.